Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So we're bringing back, this time, a returning guest, Eric Blanc, noted, socialist, intellectual, labor historian, assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct, yes.
Ryan's used to being mistaken, so he waits to be corrected sometimes.
Hang on, I can go back. Let me mess something up here. Blank, is it, or the Eric? But yeah, at any rate, so you pitched us on this article, which I've just reread. It's all about the sewer socialists of, Milwaukee and Wisconsin. And I greatly enjoyed it. We'll link it in the show notes. And I think we'll get into it. But in one way, I was very surprised at how relevant it all sounded. I was like, hey, hang on, this is we've been doing the great cycle of history here, 100 years of going in circles. But so anyway, to sort of set the frame for the discussion, can you tell us who these people were? Who are our sort of main characters?
Sure. And just to say, the reason I wrote the article, maybe it should just be made explicit, is obviously we have a socialist mayor now in New York City. And that was the impetus for trying to understand basically how this worked before, because the sewer socialists ran Milwaukee for almost 50 years. And so some of the leading players, you have Victor Berger, who is a German Austrian immigrant, who is essentially the founder of the sewer socialists. They didn't call themselves sewer socialists. Incidentally, this was like a pejorative term by socialists who said they weren't real socialists and that they were just interested in public services. It's one of the things I contest in the article. I try to show actually they were, they had their eyes on the prize of getting rid of capitalism. But nevertheless, the sewer socialists were founded by Victor Berger, who's really like their intellectual and sort of practical organizer leader until he died in the late 1920s. Also the first socialist congressperson in the United States. He was sort of the equivalent of, if you want to think about the buzz AOC made when she got elected to Congress, it was something like that. When he wins in 1910, it's like, oh my God, the socialists are a thing. It was the same year that they won the mayorship. So, this was like their first big entry. And it's the moment in which people start taking socialism seriously, sort of on a wide scale in the United States. They elect a mayor in 1910, but the real longstanding socialist mayor at the heart of the sort of movement was this guy, Dan Hoan, who was the mayor for 24 years, from 1916 through 1940. So this is a long time. And it gives you some sense of how successful they were. Milwaukee, they kept on voting the socialists back in because they were delivering. And there was a really fun article I found from Time Magazine, 1936, where it was the cover story on Dan Hoan. It's called Marxist Mayor. He gave Karl Marx all the credit. And they see in this article, in the introduction, that sort of by almost all accounts, Milwaukee is the best governed city in the country. So it does give you a sense of how effective they were. And also that they were Marxists until by the end. They didn't actually downplay their radicalism, but they saw that you wouldn't ever be able to get to socialist revolution or overthrowing capitalism if you couldn't prove to workers in the meantime that you could deliver and win.
Yeah, this perhaps is one of the first places to start talking about, modern day resonances here is in this debate between your kind of purist, sectarian, perhaps you could say, or more sort of quote unquote radical, factions. And you talk about the Socialist Labor Party versus the Social Democratic Party, and that was that Berger fellow. Can you describe for us like the sort of conflict between those two as it goes? Is that, I didn't actually know that sewer socialist, does that come from the sort of more rigorous hardcore, I guess, for lack of a better word, socialist critique of these supposed reformer moderate types?
Yeah, the etymology of the word is a little contested. Most people say that it goes back to Morris Hillquit, who was actually more of a centrist Marxist. So he was considered himself to the left of the sewer socialists, but he was not, he was not like a crazy ultra leftist. In Milwaukee, the first socialist organization, as you mentioned, was the Socialist Labor Party. And so just to give a sort of modern day analogy, this is like the equivalent of a party of a lot of people who you see online, like denouncing AOC, denouncing Bernie, and sort of making clear that everyone else is a sellout and that if we uphold the right revolutionary line, then, the masses will come to us. So we see the resonance in big debates have still today, which is essentially, is your theory of change that you have to put forward just the right and most uncompromising ideas and eventually the masses will come around? So this is one theory of history. And, you can understand why people would think that, but it's very counterposed to an idea that, well, most workers, and this is something Berger said, most workers aren't going to accept socialist ideas currently because they're resigned to their fate. There's an acceptance of just basic capitalist social relationship and also just capitalist social norms and ideas. And if you're going to sort of raise workers' ambitions to where you could ever get a majority to overcome capitalism, you need to essentially have wins, and you need to be able to help people have a sense of collective agency and that the state can deliver more. And so depending on what your underlying theory of change is, then there's a lot of different takes on how many compromises you're willing to make in the short term. And the socialists believed in, it was necessary to make compromises, for instance, like working with other parties to pass legislation, working, if you didn't get your full goal, it was still good to get it halfway there. It was good to sort of not just run on elections and saying we need to overthrow capitalism, but trying to say what you're going to change in the meantime. And that's why they were proud. They were proud that they fixed the sewers. And it's a little condescending in hindsight to chastise them that, because first of all, it's not really the main thing they did. They had much more ambitious projects and wins. We can talk about that. But just for the record, like if you're in 1910, there's typhoid epidemics across like major cities, including Milwaukee. Kids are dying. So it was like an urgent working class need to have your kids not die from typhoid. And so they were really excited to have sewers that work. And so I do think that's just worth flagging. Yeah. There's kind of like there's a condescending thing. It looks inevitable in hindsight, but really they were really centrally focused on kind of something Zohran did, which is you have to start with the basic fundamental fight for survival of working class people. Their insecurities, material, the bread and butter. If you can't provide for those sort of basic needs, and if you can't speak to that, then workers aren't going to take you serious on the bigger things.
It strikes me, first of all, that sewer socialism would be a critique. Strikes me as very bourgeois, which is ironic. I think, like, you know what I mean? Like, what kind of person thinks that getting dirty or getting down to like dealing with the garbage in the sewer is it's too low brow or something. But secondly, what you say is, I think, important in a number of ways. But the kind of purist who says, by virtue of winning office, you're already a sellout. And I've just anticipated every betrayal already. And I have the high ground morally and politically because I'm savvy enough to see the betrayal and every possible motive is going to be a cynically motivated one. That's never how power has been, built over time with that approach. And it's also not very dialectical. It's not very dialectical. It's also strikes me as utopian socialist to say, let's just like convince people with ideas. Or wait around for like the movement of history without being part of it. So that's flawed in so many ways. But today, like, it strikes me that the relevance to Zohran is first and foremost about understanding how concrete, specific, and material the movement of history is, and how addressing things like affordability is the way that you change class consciousness, which is something that this history you've written about shows us, right?
Yeah. And, they were able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So one of the interesting things about them is, they remained socialist in the sense that like they would have forums on this is why capitalism is bad. And, and they had their program. And if you read their program, they were talking about making an economic democracy. It's not like their horizon was limited to just creating a better city or, good governance or a welfare state. But if you look at what they ran on, so if you can look at the flyers that they've put out, the advertisements they, took out in their newspaper, they're talking, it's just like, how can you get by? We will lower your bills. These are the things that people really cared about. And, and it wasn't just that, but that was the centerpiece. It was also, it was the bread, but it was also the roses too. They wanted working class people to have access to parks. And again, like, okay, you can say, well, that's not that big of a deal. Well, it's a pretty big deal if you're living in a slum that you have no access to the amenities of the good things of life. And so they had like free opera in the city and parks and made cities some place that workers could both survive in and afford to, but also that they could enjoy. So I do think that there was a kind of bread and roses piece to their project.
Yeah,
I mean, socializing, a lot of social, like recreational focus.
Yeah,
which is cool.
No, I want to come back to that, but I think just before it really illustrates, I think, how this sort of dichotomy, supposedly of being like more hardcore versus more moderate, is really not what we're talking about. It's more like a question of your approach to politics? Is it sort of idealistic or is it pragmatic? Because there are a lot of figures in American history, like these sewer socialist mayors and leaders. They struck me as very similar to Thaddeus Stevens, the famous radical Republican, anti-slavery guy, who was as principled and, rigorous an ideologue in his like personal politics as you will find in American history. Like the man had himself buried in an integrated, cemetery because like there was he would not accept segregation even in death. And yet when it came time to, as Lyndon Johnson would say, get down to the nut cutting, where you're actually going to pass a bill, like he would take that half a loaf every time, because he was like, he had his lodestar, his principles, but it was also like you take what you can get in the moment. And it seems like you're not really more of more socialist, like shall we say less moderate, if you refuse to take the compromise. It's just like a sort of prudential versus sort of extremist approach to politics, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's an underlying question here, which is, what does it mean to do mass socialist politics in the United States? Because one of the real issues that so many socialists had and still have is a tendency to essentially import strategy from other countries where the political context is just really different. And so that's sort of the plausibility of some of these sectarian theories, is that using these approaches that seem to have worked really well in like the Russian Revolution or the Russian Empire, or at this time, Germany was the real, model, both of which were authoritarian states in which there wasn't real political freedom. There wasn't sort of a legitimate parliament. And so the way workers responded to politics in those contexts was just different. And there was a tendency of American socialists, including the Socialist Labor Party, to assume that what worked there could work here. And a big part of the project of Berger and the sewer socialists was to try to like Americanize Marxism and to try to understand the specificities of sort of the political structure and the dynamics of class struggle in the United States, and to have a very sober and open-minded assessment of like, what would it take to win? And I think that I really like that, because one of the things Berger said, which you just don't see much, is he says, well, we have a lot to learn, like we actually don't have all the answers. And so this kind of pragmatic approach, not just in making compromises, but in trying to like rigorously assess the terrain, to me, that's a huge part of their contribution. Yeah,
there's very much a lot of sort of cargo cult, revolution that we could somehow replay and make everything 1917 again. It's like those days are dead and gone, have been for a long time. Even the days of, mass industrial working class is kind of gone too. So can you talk a little bit about the initial victories? Like, how did they come to power? How did they win, and how did they cement that power once they got in office?
It's worth saying that they didn't start primarily electorally. And I think this is important, something we can come back to, because the movement was always sort of an inside and outside the state approach. And it started primarily in the unions. So the first thing Berger did really for like the first 15 years, we're talking like late 1800s years, work to recruit socialists from the labor movement and to sort of have socialists win over leadership in the unions. And that was their big coup, really, is that by 1899, they'd won a majority of the leadership in the Milwaukee trade union movement and eventually across the state. And so it's based on this union power that they started running for aldermen, city council. They won a few seats in 1904, and they proved to be pretty effective. Like they were out there doing stuff, and people were like, oh, it's good that they're not corrupt. This is another thing we haven't mentioned, is a huge part of the context, especially at first, was there's just this insane amount of corruption in city politics all across the country. And what the sewer socialists said, and I think it proved to be right, is, well, we're not corruptible because we don't want to work really with like hand in hand with big business. We understand big business to fundamentally be an opponent to progress. And so, that's why they couldn't get bought. And they ran on that platform to say, we're going to push back against all of these sort of politicians who are just making these very shady deals with contracts and things like that. They won in 1904 some city council races. And then based off of their success in office as city council, they had their big coup in 1910 where they won the mayorship. And they ended up actually getting booted out of office 2 years later, in part because they remained so radical. The middle class kind of got scared a little bit. And it wasn't until 1916 that they won it back. But then from 1916 to 1940, City Hall was theirs. And part of the reason they were able to get reelected so many times was not just that they did clean government, but that they were very effective at pushing through policies that made people's lives better. So just to give, a couple examples. One thing is they took efficiency really seriously. And so this is as an immediate resonancy with Zohran. And actually, if you read the interview Zohran did around the debates around abundance, Zohran explicitly cites the sewer socialists as a sort of legacy to build off of, because they understood that they wanted to make public services work. And part of the way that to make that happen is they had to make them much more efficient and deliver. And they didn't just want more funding for public services. They wanted to streamline it. And they actually had the first commission on efficiency anywhere in the country. It's imagine a good, not evil Doge. That was what they did. They brought in John Comm and some of these experts from Madison sort of labor world. And they did it. They did modern administration. You could say, oh, okay, well, this is sounds like good government stuff. But for them, it was crucial because they wanted to municipalize for instance, most of the energy structure. They wanted to municipalize the transit, and they ended up doing a lot of that. And they knew that they weren't going to be able to convince Milwaukeeans to keep on voting for them and to keep on sort of moving further and further down more public control if these sort of institutions were riddled with inefficiency and corruption. So they saw these two things as going hand in hand. And it was basically based on delivering and continuing to deliver that workers kept on putting them back into office. That being said, it was always tenuous. They almost never had a city council majority. And so this is one of the really sad things, and it's sobering in many ways about our project, is that they were both very pragmatic and nevertheless they still had a really hard time getting a full majority in city council. And so it was not for lack of trying. And it does say something, I think, about just the maybe dead weight of political opinion in the United States, that it is actually quite hard. And it's not just lack of will on the part of socialists, that we're going up against centuries of sort of accumulated inertia and red baiting and racism and all of these things. And so it was tenuous. I wouldn't say that they were able to implement their full agenda, but they did their best within this kind of constrained context.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd like to get to that more later, because you talk about the main obstacle being somewhat ideological, public opinion, and retrenching to kind of more reactionary or conservative understandings of maybe the public-private division in politics or something to that effect. But maybe you could just talk a bit more about the types of accomplishments in terms of the relationship to capitalism, like the public goods, the decommodification, recreation, some of the things that made people's lives better, and how that relates to that project that we think of as ideological.
Sure. Some of the big things they immediately did were making people's sort of city and work lives much safer and healthier. So for instance, they had the first, I believe, in the country, city-run inspectors for factories to make sure that there was clean ventilation, things like that. The sewers we already talked about. But they had a major project on, actually what now we might think of almost as environmentalism, but it wasn't really framed as environmentalism. It was framed as how to have workers not get sick and die. And they did a lot of that. They also had a massive expansion of the public sector. So various utilities were municipalized. They did a sort of robust infrastructure to build out sort of the public infrastructure in the city, things like the port. They had a massive expansion of parks and social centers. They were really proud of their social centers. And this goes to a little bit what you alluded to before, that there was a real cultural communitarian dynamic here, where a big part of what they were trying to do is encourage civic engagement and sort of what we call just community building. So they had social centers all across the city that were, teenagers could play billiards, which was a little bit risque at the time, because it was considered somehow, there was a debate. They said, oh, you're going to be, sort of encouraging sort of vagrancy on the part of teens. And they said, no, if you take the pool tables out of the bars, then actually the kids will still come. And they were proven right. But it wasn't just the pool, they had things for little kids. They had, multiple events a week on music and speeches. And so they had this kind of really robust civic associational life. They also really had a major focus on just lowering the cost of living. So to give one example, one of their more ambitious and radical initiatives was during World War I, where there was huge food shortages, right? So the price of goods is just going really, really high up. Daniel Hone, the mayor, socialist mayor, goes over city council's head, doesn't tell anybody he's doing this, and just essentially goes out and buys truckloads, train car loads, many dozens of train car loads full of food and clothing, essentially like surplus from the army. And he brings it back and he sells it out of city offices at cost, right? So like no markup, which ended up being like half of what people were paying in the sort of free market. And it was a huge success. And there was an outcry, people were accusing him of communism, but, obviously working class people thought it was great because like all of a sudden you can get the things you need to survive at a much cheaper price. And Hone, afterwards he was basked in the victory. And he said, look, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to show that actually, when you take out the profit motive, people's lives can get better, that the state can deliver, and you don't actually need this profit motive. And that really, I think, gets at what they were trying to do, which is to prove in practice that the public good and the public provision could be just as effective, in many ways more effective than the private sector.
Yeah, the affordability thing, from Zohran, it initially gave me I was a little bit wary of it, because like traditionally that is a very sort of conservative coded point of argumentation. Like this is something that Reagan talked about a lot, that the everything's getting more expensive. And the problem is that the workers are making too much money. We got to bust the unions. We got to get wages down. And there was definitely a dynamic to that. I even saw that quite a bit on the left, during the Biden years inflation, that people would bitch about their DoorDash becoming more expensive. And the overwhelming reason for that is that wages at the bottom went up by a lot. And so basically servant labor of any kind became much more pricey. And so your burrito taxi was, quite a luxury. But what Zohran convinced me of, and I think this shows as well, a great historical example of it, is it's not necessarily the case that there is a socialist way to approach affordability through public provision of necessary, commodities and services and stuff like that at a fair price, and to take on, the corporate owned utilities and the big corporations and whatnot who are gouging the shit out of you and not paying their workers very much either, and just taking home a big fat profit. And that, yeah, as you say, at the end of the day, like as on the rights, if they're both managed professionally, a public grocery store should be able to outcompete a private one because they don't need to make any profit. So you can win on price. And I think that's just such a great lesson historically, and a way to combat the right when it comes to, the only way to fight inflation is to cause a recession on purpose and throw lots of people out of work so that we have a huge, desperate, reserve army of labor that will take any job.
To be fair to the other side's argument about purism, and you alluded to this, Eric, earlier, the argument isn't so much that you need to wait around for the revolution; it's that non-electoral politics is what matters, and organizing, union organizing, and all that. But as you write, there's a symbiosis between electoral success that socialists have and the increasing of labor power, right?
Right. So that's a huge part of their project. And I'm glad you asked about that. Is, again, keep in mind, like most of the people they elected were blue collar workers and union leaders or union activists. And really, so you're talking, it's like cobblers and like, a machinist. It's pretty amazing when you see the types of folks who were elected. And building union power was central to their project. So some of the things they did, for instance, one of the big fights they had was they wanted to make it impossible for the bosses to do what they normally did, which is to rely on local police to break strikes. And interestingly, this goes to a lot of hot button debates around defund the police and all of that. They didn't try to defund the police. They actually went over the head of the reactionary police commissioner, gave raises to the police, but simultaneously fought really hard to essentially make it impossible legally for cops to intervene in strikes. And that was it makes a big difference because all of a sudden it was much harder for the employers to essentially stop workers from unionizing and from winning strikes. And it really, this becomes a through line in their fight, is that over and over again, they're trying to use city government to help build up working class power. And I think it's just worth saying that really was in many ways their theory of change. It was not so much that we're going to get socialism through just gradually expanding public services. They imagined that, but really their metric for success was how powerful and class conscious the working class got. Like that's what they saw as, if they were making progress, even if they lost this or that policy battle, they were trying to give workers some sort of sense of collective power. And they did that remarkably effectively. In the 1930s, Milwaukee became the city in the country with the highest union density. According to some of the reports, they got up to 60%, which is just astronomical. Wow. This is like Finland, Sweden levels. New York City, just by contrast, at its peak, really only reached like 33% union density. So you're just talking about an incredibly powerful movement from below combined with the state from above. And that ultimately, to go ahead a little bit, is part of the reason they end up getting voted out of office, because there's a specific law they passed in 1935 called the Bond-Cell Ordinance, which is just like, there's no other law like this I've heard in the books in the United States, which is that in 1935, because imagine the context, workers are trying to unionize, they're trying to build power across the city, and there's strike after strike. And the city and the mayor they pass a law, the ordinance, that if the employers refuse to respect a union, right, that is workers voting to unionize, and then there's protests of over 200 people 2 days in a row because they had to have, like, this was the legal pretext, it was public safety, then the city would shut down the company and either fine or jail the business owners, right?
Now we're talking.
Yeah, so you can understand why there's huge backlash from the business community, and they do everything possible really from 1935 onwards to try to kick the socialists out of power. And, it takes them a while, it takes them 5 years, but it was not for lack of fighting the bosses. In many ways, it was because they fought the bosses quite consistently and effectively that there was this backlash.
I mean, as I was saying, these folks were not, they did not become, corrupted by office and turn into milquetoast dweeby, time servers. It was like, yeah, you build your power up and then you use it. You turn the power of state violence on the bosses instead of the workers.
It's so obvious when you think about it, because of course it's the corollary to like the use of the system to smash unions, the right to work, Wisconsin, right? The right to work, so-called laws that actually crush the ability to collectively bargain and to unionize. If the right can use power that way to suppress the ability of unions to come together, like, it just makes so much sense that you'd want to use the state to those ends to counter that, right?
Yeah, and they did it, and it's remarkable. Like, you can see Dan Hone. There's these cool pictures of him as mayor. He's speaking in front of, like, I don't know, 20,000 striking auto factory workers. His inauguration speech after re-inauguration 1932. So he's elected, it's the height of the Depression. And he starts off by saying, it's the death throes of the capitalist system. The socialist commonwealth is, we can see it, what's going to happen. Over optimistic. As many socialists, we always, tend to lean a little over optimistic. But they were trying, like, that was their North Star.
Well, when did the kind of swan song begin? Because I'm trying to think, especially with the civic associations and the work of Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone. There's even a great documentary from friend of the pod, Pete Davis, called Join or Die about that. He was a student of Putnam's that charts the rise in the 20th century of unions and all kinds of civic associations and all kinds of communal activities, and then the sharp decline, of course. It coincides, obviously, with neoliberalism, the decline, and all kinds of other things. But I'm curious, just because the history here has so much of that bolstering of both unions and civic associations, if the decline matches that overall trend in the country.
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky. The sewer socialists get voted out of office sort of in a decisive way for the first time in 1940. That's when Dan Hone loses. And that is reflective of a process that people sort of overlook a lot right now when we think about the 30s, but really starting in mid-1937 up for the next 3 years, there's a huge backlash across the country against radicalism, particularly in response to the sit-down strikes, but then also this is maybe when FDR goes the furthest left. And there's just huge backlash. The bosses, raise hell. Farmers sort of start turning away from urban workers for the first time because there's so many strikes. It seems like there's chaos. And in that context, there's backlash all across the country. Progressives lose everywhere in 1938. The socialists sort of managed to hold on to the city mayor, but everywhere else, sort of a bloodbath. So there's already a tide against what they're doing in the late 30s. And that reflects in 1940 when they get voted out. What's interesting, it's a little bit of an appendix, is that their movement essentially, it collapses after 1940. The party becomes much smaller. The unions jump ship. But there's such a tradition still of sewer socialism that kind of, despite the absence of their party structure, and it's really a different phenomenon. In 1948, they elect another socialist mayor. Kind of by the establishment didn't do a good job over the 8 years, 1940, 1948, and those people are like, give the socialists a shot again. They did pretty good last time, and they elect a guy, Frank Zeidler, who ends up being the mayor from 1948 to 1960, and in some ways, it's a very different context. It's a Cold War context, and the movement is different. It's a little less radical. But one thing that's worth it's just interesting to note is this, again, they end up getting kicked out of office. They end up losing not because they were too moderate, but because they were too radical, and particularly around integration. So like one of the big fights of the Zeidler administration is to integrate Milwaukee. And, he's like a very forthright fighter for civil rights and to make it actually happen. And in response to that, both like white workers and white middle class, but particularly the big business, which had its own reasons for wanting to, which weren't just about race, but were about, encroachments on their power and profits. They essentially do like race baiting against the socialist to kick him out of office. And eventually they hound him so much that he decides in 1960 not even to run again because they've just made his life so miserable.
What a reminder of the long entanglement of capitalism and racism. Definitely, two phenomena that have a long history together.
Plus, so the short version, the short, that was long. It was not that was not a short version. But the thing worth flagging is that they essentially decline even before the associational decline. I think Putnam really flags it as like after the 60s, late 60s onwards. And so this shows that in many ways the peak had already been reached as far as politically, in part though because of the decline of this radical thrust, and many of the people who had really built the union movement and becomes bureaucratized, that in many ways, at least for the union movement, paves the way then for the 70s and 80s decline.
And the role of race baiting, or just the way that race was used as a cudgel against worker power and class power, does that become worse in this FDR period than it was prior in the earlier part of the 20th century in Wisconsin and Milwaukee? Or how did because there's also a long history of race within socialism and unions as a divisive issue. So how did that play out?
Yeah, the sewer socialists at first, or at least Victor Berger at first, was quite racist. It was not like a big part of their practice or program early on, in part because Milwaukee was almost entirely white up until World War I. But they were really bad. They were bad on immigration and bad on race issues. And actually, that's what Berger, if anything, is known for these days. If you read something about like the sewer socialists, to say Berger's like always given as the example of how racist socialists could be. But what's missing from that, and what's so interesting to me, is that basically after World War I, once there became a significant Black population in the city, the sewer socialists, including Berger, just make a complete U-turn. And it wasn't really for like electoral reasons, because it was still like 1% of the population. So this was not like the big decisive block of voters. But Victor Berger, who had been sort of like open white supremacist, turns around for reasons that I actually think need more historical investigation. His number one plank in 1922, when he's running for election for Congress, is against race hatred and against the KKK. His number one plank. And they really, it's like remarkable. I've spent just the last few weeks reading through like their newspapers in the 20s. It's just one thing after another against race hatred. And it's not even just sort of like class versus class, unite Black and white workers. They're talking about lynching. They're talking about racism in the unions. So they make a shift, and that sets the parameters then for eventually getting race baited. And it was, the 20s were complicated. It's not like Milwaukee became a racist free city. There was a lot of accumulated segregation that didn't get overturned overnight, and you can get into whether they fought hard enough, fast enough. But the big story ultimately is that they did turn around their earlier racial sort of adaptation to white supremacy, so much so that it ended up becoming the thing that they ended up losing office for.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had no idea about that part of the story. This is the height of Jim Crow. You're talking about dogmatic, bipartisan consensus, white supremacy enforced at all levels of society, including like a racist, terrorist dictatorship in the South. So it took some balls to some stones to stand up to that in the 19-teens and 20s.
Dan Hone, the mayor, literally bans the KKK.
That's the end of the preview, folks. As usual, we like to mention that this podcast is sponsored by the American Prospect magazine. So if you wanted to listen to the whole thing, You can subscribe at $5 a month if you want that, plus a free subscription to the website, plus the opportunity for a steeply discounted print subscription. You can do that if you so wish at $10 a month. And otherwise, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.